In 1949, she brought her own books to set. Dostoevsky, Chekhov. Between takes, she sat in the corner with her legs folded, completely absorbed, looking up when someone called her name with the expression of a person who had genuinely been somewhere else. She laughed with her whole body. She argued about the work. She was 23 years old and nobody's fantasy. She was just herself. May 19, 1962. She stands in a corridor at Madison Square Garden, sewn into a flesh-colored dress designed to disappear under stage lighting. She is medicated. She is late. The man introducing her gets a laugh from 15,000 people just by mentioning it, because the lateness is part of the character now, part of what was built. When she sings Happy Birthday, Mr. President, the president accepts it with a joke. Every person watching understands exactly what they are seeing. None of them can see Norma Jeane. Same name, same body, 13 years apart. The woman who brought Chekhov to set, nowhere in the frame. This is not a story about how Marilyn Monroe became famous. It is a story about what was removed from Norma Jean Baker to make that possible, piece by piece while she was still alive. He replaced her while she was still alive. Old Money Wives shows what the original looked like. Subscribe so the original is never forgotten. Her name at birth was Norma Jean Mortensen, and she was baptized Norma Jean Baker, and before Hollywood was done she would be neither of those things. But first, before any of that, there was a specific person. One worth knowing precisely, because you cannot understand what was destroyed without understanding what was there before it was touched. She was born June 1, 1926, in Los Angeles. Her mother, Gladys Pearl Baker, was institutionalized for paranoid schizophrenia when Norma Jean was 7 years old. She grew up in foster homes. She grew up in an orphanage on El Centro Avenue in Hollywood. She grew up in the care of people who had not choice, and her in rooms that were never hers, in clothes handed down through other families. There was no floor beneath her childhood, nobody who was legally, emotionally, permanently responsible for whether she was all right. She learned very early to be responsible for that herself. What this produced was not what you might expect. It did not produce a passive woman. It produced a woman with extraordinary powers of observation, someone who had spent childhood reading the emotional temperature of rooms, reading the reliability of adults, reading what was actually being said beneath what was being said. She was perceptive the way people are perceptive when their perceptiveness has been tested. Not as a talent, as a survival mechanism that had sharpened over years until it was precise. She read. This tends to get buried under the image, but the record is unambiguous. She carried books, not decoratively, but the way readers carry books, with passages underlined and pages folded and the specific weight of a volume she was working through rather than performing. According to accounts from colleagues who knew her in the late 1940s, she was reading Dostoevsky, Whitman, Chekhov, the essays of Carl Sandburg. Friends who visited her apartment described walls of them. According to biographer Donald Spoto, whose 1993 biography drew on interviews and records unavailable to earlier researchers, she was enrolled in UCLA extension courses in literature and art history as early as 1951, attending evening classes while working studio days. She did not do this to seem educated. She did it because the ideas were alive to her in a way that made her want more of them. She had opinions, and she delivered them directly. Colleagues recalled her arguing on set, not as temperament, but as genuine intellectual engagement with the work. She questioned directors. She pushed back on motivations. She asked why a character would make a specific choice, and she kept asking until the answer was true enough to build a performance on. At a time when contract players were expected to absorb direction without comment, she questioned it. At a time when the studio system treated actresses as interchangeable components of a production machine, she treated herself as a craftsperson who had a legitimate view about how the craft should be done. According to production records from her time at 20th Century Fox, these questions were logged as problems, not as contributions. Problems. Her humor was specific and dry and fast. Not the comedic softness that would later be constructed for public consumption, but the sharper timing of someone who had grown up needing to read situations quickly and had learned to use wit as both entertainment and navigation. People who worked alongside her before the voice coaching described a different register entirely. Direct, quick, occasionally cutting in the way that very perceptive people are sometimes cutting when they see something clearly that everyone around them is pretending not to. She was not easy. Let the record be clear about this. The original was not a simple person or an uncomplicated one. A childhood without reliable protection produces specific qualities, and difficult was among them. She trusted slowly and remembered everything. She could move toward warmth with an intensity that overwhelmed a room, and then withdraw into a distance so complete she was effectively absent. The people who loved her in those years said the navigation between those states was something you had to learn, and learning it was worth it because what was on the other side was a person who was genuinely, specifically, irreplaceably herself. And she wanted this above everything, this more than fame, more than money, more than the approval the industry kept offering her on conditions. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, not celebrated. Serious. The distinction mattered to her in a way she articulated across years of interviews. Letters and private notes. She wanted the work to be real. She wanted a performance to do something, to reach a person in a theater seat who was alone with something they could not say, and make them feel less alone with it. That is, according to her own letters, the specific thing she wanted her work to do. That is the ambition of a serious artist. That is not the ambition of someone who wants to be a fantasy. He had been watching. He had been cataloging. What she was and what he needed her to be were not the same thing. The distance between them was what he would spend the next 13 years closing. He is not a single man. This is the first and most important thing to understand about the replacement performed on Norma Jeane Baker, because if you imagine a single villain, one man who decided one day to destroy one woman, you will miss how it actually worked, and missing how it actually worked means you will not recognize it when it happens in other forms. The designer was a system. It had faces: Daryl F. Zanuck, the head of 20th Century Fox; Ben Lyon, the talent executive; the acting coaches brought in to adjust what they found; the publicity department, which rewrote her history and coached her on what to say when asked about the parts that had been rewritten. Each man had a role. Together, without any formal meeting, they operated as a single machine with a single output requirement. What the machine required: a woman who generated desire without threatening it. The early 1950s were a specific crisis moment for Hollywood. Television had arrived and was taking the audience. Ticket sales were declining. The studios needed something television could not deliver, and after considerable internal calculation, documented in studio memos and production records from the period, what they determined television could not deliver was a certain kind of female body in a certain kind of relationship with a paying audience. Available in feeling, controlled in reality. Warm enough to invite desire, blank enough not to redirect it. A surface, not a person, because a person has agency and a surface does not. The original version of Norma Jeane Baker was built in a way that made her categorically unable to function as that product. She was perceptive. That reads as presence, not availability. The camera can tell the difference between a woman looking at the audience and a woman looking at herself being looked at. The first is engaging. The second is unsettling. What the studio needed was the second. The original had the first. She had opinions which were incompatible with the blankness the product required. She had an intellectual life which gave her somewhere to stand that the machine had not provided and could not, therefore, control. The original was a person. Persons are not surfaces. He did not want another woman. He wanted this woman remade. That is a different kind of destruction entirely. The substitute they began designing in 1946 was named Marilyn Monroe. The name change was brokered by Ben Lyon during her signing with Fox. Lyon suggested Marilyn. She chose Monroe from her maternal grandmother's name, and the original signed the form that would become the most consequential document in the substitution. She was 19 years old, and she thought she was signing a contract. She was signing a frame. The frame needed specific contents. A voice trained away from directness into the register of perpetual intimate disclosure. Breathed rather than spoken. Every sentence arriving as though confiding something secret. A walk slowed and waited until the body moving through space announced itself in a way that Norma Jeane Baker's body never had. A biography simplified until only the parts that generated the right emotional response remained. The complex parts filed away where a journalist would not find them. And above all, a public intellectual identity that was not an identity but a negation. The woman who didn't understand, who didn't realize, who was beautiful in the specific way that requires no one to take her seriously. These were not separate decisions made by separate people at separate moments. They were components of a single product specification, assembled over years, installed one piece at a time. Every piece that went in required a piece of her to come out first. That is what this video documents. Not the image that resulted. The cost of building it, paid in specific things that were hers before they were taken. Paid while she was still alive, still reading, still writing in notebooks in the small hours of the morning. Still, in the rooms the machine had not yet reached, fighting to remain herself. The first piece removed was her voice. Not the voice she used in private, that would survive longer, audible to people who knew her in rooms where cameras were not present. What was removed first was the public version. The rhythm, the speed, the directness. The voice of someone who had spent childhood reading rooms quickly and learned to speak at the pace of what she was thinking rather than the pace of what she was supposed to seem like. The mechanism was acting coaching, documented, systematic, and oriented entirely toward the product the studio needed rather than the instrument it found. According to accounts confirmed in Spoto's biography and in Anthony Summers' research, extensive coaching on vocal delivery began in the early Fox contract years. The coaches had a specification. The specification was not Norma Jeane Baker's natural voice. It was a sound that would operate at the specific frequency of the male gaze. Intimate, effortful, breathed rather than spoken, every sentence arriving as though disclosure cost her something, as though the audience was receiving something private that had been meant for them specifically. The breathiness was coached. The slight upward inflection that turned declarative statements into apparent questions was coached. The yellow negation of vowels, that specific suspended quality, as though she were perpetually mid-thought, perpetually waiting for someone to finish what she had started, was coached. All of it is documented. None of it was hers. What she understood about the removal at the time. She was being made more commercially viable. That was the framing offered to her, and it was accurate as far as it went. The voice worked. It worked on camera in a way that immediately drove numbers, audience responses, studio executive enthusiasm, the specific commercial metrics that determined whether a contract player's option would be renewed. She understood in 1949 that she was using a tool. What she did not understand was that tools, used long enough, reshape the hand that holds them. This is the part that took me longest to understand. He did not want her gone. He wanted her remade. That is a specific kind of violence that leaves no mark, because from the outside, the only thing visible is success. The voice worked and kept working, and every time it worked, the original voice retreated a little further. Not dramatically, not in a single moment. Incrementally, the way something is replaced not by removal but by substitution, so gradually the original feels like the aberration and the substitute feels like the default. By 1951, people who met her at industry events heard only the substitute's voice. The original was still audible, in private, in the moments she forgot to perform, but the public instrument had been successfully replaced. What replaced it was his. What it replaced was hers. That exchange happened once. Then again. Then again. The first full piece of the substitute installed after the voice was the biography. Norma Jeane Baker had a specific childhood. Foster homes. An orphanage. A mother in a psychiatric institution. Years of institutional instability in which the consistent theme was the absence of anyone reliably responsible for her well-being. This was her actual history. And it was, from the studio publicity department's perspective, raw material requiring significant processing before it could be used. The substitute required an origin story that generated sympathy without generating complexity. Sympathy was useful. The poor girl who made good, the orphan who became a star. Complexity was not. A childhood that required real understanding would lead journalists toward real questions, and real questions led to real answers, and real answers produced a person rather than a product. The processing was documented and deliberate. The orphanage was retained, it produced the right quality of pathos. The specific texture of those years, the particular failures of multiple households, the quality of institutional care in Los Angeles in the 1930s, the details that would have told a careful reader something true about why she was the way she was smoothed into a simpler story. According to accounts from the publicity period, she was coached on what to say when asked about her childhood. She was coached specifically on what not to say. What the installation required of her was this. She had to put the real version down when the cameras were on. Not forever. Just in public. Just when it mattered. Just every time. What the substitute looked like after the first installation. Clean. Presentable. The product had a past that generated feeling without generating inconvenient reality. The original's actual history, the one that would have explained to anyone paying attention exactly who she was and why her perceptiveness was so precise and her trust so carefully rationed, was filed out of frame. It did not disappear. It was stored. The distinction matters. The voice was the first thing removed because it was the most visible. What came next was less visible and more damaging. The second piece removed was her professional authority. Her willingness to say, in rooms that mattered, what she actually thought. The original had always had is quality. From the earliest accounts of her professional life, she questioned direction, argued for different character readings, pushed back on scenes she thought were being constructed wrongly. She was not doing this for attention. She was doing it because she cared about getting the work right, and getting the work right required engaging with it honestly rather than performing compliance. The production records from Fox documented this as a problem, not a contribution. Problem. The removal was not commanded. There was no memo, no direct instruction to be quiet. What there was instead was a feedback system so precise it achieved the same result. When she questioned direction publicly, the stories that reached the press described her as difficult, unreliable, unstable. When she complied, the coverage was warm, the option renewed, the next role offered. The mechanism was invisible. The result was not. The cost of the original surfacing in professional contexts went up incrementally until the original stopped surfacing there. What this installation required that the first had not. She had to suppress something ongoing. The voice coaching had removed a piece of her history, something that existed in the past. This installation required her to monitor herself in real time, in the middle of the work she cared most about, and choose silence over the argument that might have gotten it right. What she kept? The opinions. They did not go anywhere. They went underground, into letters, into notebooks, into the conversations she had in private with people she trusted. But in the rooms where they might have mattered, they were gone. After the second installation, the people who had known her before still recognized her face. They no longer recognized what was behind it. Two pieces removed. The public voice. The professional authority. The substitute was taking shape, and the machine had learned something important from the first two installations. The most effective removals were not the ones that felt like punishment. They were the ones that felt like progress. She cooperated with the first because it was framed as opportunity. She cooperated with the second because resistance was made too expensive. The third installation used a different mechanism entirely. It did not take something from her. It took something from the world's ability to see her. This is the installation that reveals most precisely what the system actually required, because what it targeted was not a behavior or a history but a structure. The original read seriously, thought seriously, and had the internal ballast that comes from knowing you are intelligent and having evidence to support the knowledge. That ballast is not just about self-esteem. It is about having somewhere to stand that the system has not provided. It means that when someone tells you who you are, you have access to an internal counterargument. A woman with that kind of ballast cannot be fully controlled, because she has a floor beneath her that is not the machine's floor. The installation could not remove the intellectual life. That was private, inaccessible, hers. What it could do, and what it systematically did, was make the intellectual life invisible in public, and then make the invisible version of her the one that existed in the world. The mechanism was the dumb blonde. Not as a single decision but as a sustained publicity construction. Every interview coached to produce apparent bafflement, every genuine insight she offered publicly framed as an accident. Something that had escaped the character rather than something she had intended. The framing was so comprehensive that when she said intelligent things in press coverage, they ran as jokes. The joke was always the same. She didn't realize she was being funny. What the installation was designed to produce, beyond the immediate publicity result. Exhaustion. A woman who knows she is intelligent but must publicly perform the opposite. Te eventually experiences the gap between those two states as a physical weight. The performance must be maintained every time the cameras are on. The real version must be concealed every time they are. What was designed to exhaust her, exhausted her. The record of the later years shows it clearly. What remained of the original after 3 installations? The mind itself, the opinions, the capacity for serious work. All intact, all private, all accessible only in the rooms where the substitute was not required. The public Marilyn Monroe was a performance of such thoroughness that it had learned to run without apparent effort. The effort it was concealing was enormous. And here is where she pushed back. Not in an interview. Not in a public statement. She pushed back the way people push back when they have been stripped of every institutional lever. By choosing, in private, where she would direct her life. The marriages that followed were not simply romantic decisions. They were, in the specific context of what the machine had been doing, the closest thing she had left to a structural refusal. In 1954, she married Joe DiMaggio. In 1956, she married Arthur Miller. Both marriages are discussed in biography primarily as personal choices, and both were, in part. What they are almost never discussed as, and what the record supports, is their function as acts of resistance against a machine that had decided her private life was also a publicity asset to be managed. The substitute the system had built had no private life that was not a publicity asset. Romantic attachments were resources, useful when they generated the right coverage, manageable when they did not. The machine expected her private life to remain inside its perimeter. Accessible, controllable, usable. It had not anticipated that she would use her private life as a hiding place. That is what the Miller marriage was. Arthur Miller was an intellectual, a playwright, a man whose first language was the language of ideas and serious work. According to Miller's own memoir Time Bends, the relationship between them was one of genuine intellectual partnership. She read his work seriously. She discussed it seriously. She told him, in the conversation that was private and therefore real, what she actually thought about things, the work, the industry, herself. According to his account, she was a genuine intellectual interlocutor, not a celebrity companion who happened to be present. The system's response was immediate and documented. The publicity apparatus did not try to end the marriage. It absorbed it. The framing that reached the public made her lucky and incidental, the beautiful accident in a serious man's life, the dumb blonde who had somehow landed the intellectual, stripping her of the agency the relationship actually contained and turning the one space where the original had room to breathe into another surface for the substitute's image. She had refused the installation and held the space of the marriage. The machine moved the wall to surround it and kept building. After 4 installations, the substitute was nearly complete. What remained of the original could be counted. He was counting it. She did not disappear without a fight. This matters. The record of the resistance matters as much as the record of the replacement, and it has been buried under the mythology of passive victimhood in a way that would have frustrated her. Because she was not passive and she knew exactly what was being done to her, and she made specific, documented, institutional moves to stop it. In 1954, she sued 20th Century Fox. Let that land for a moment. A woman who had spent 8 years being managed, directed, coached, and marketed by one of the most powerful studios in the world walked into a legal proceeding and said, "The contract is invalid. I am not what you contracted for. I am forming my own production company, Marilyn Monroe Productions, co-founded with photographer Milton H. Gr. Jeane, was incorporated in January 1955. According to documented business records, she was one of the first actresses of her era to hold ownership of her own production entity, giving her the right to approve projects, participate in profit, and, most importantly, control which version of herself was presented to the camera. The studio had not built this exit into the arrangement. She found it. She moved to New York, enrolled in the Actors Studio under Lee Strasberg, whose method required students to excavate the most honest version of what they were feeling and put it directly in front of an audience with nowhere to hide. According to accounts from the studio, including statements from Strasberg himself, her work there was serious. Paula Strasberg, who became her personal coach, described her preparation for roles during this period as thorough, disciplined, and motivated by genuine artistic purpose. The original hid here, in the room where the work was measured by truth rather than commercial viability, where the substitute was irrelevant because the substitute could not do what the actor's studio required. Bus Stop in 1956. The Prince and the Showgirl in 1957. Some Like It Hot in 1959, in which her comic performance was precise and technically demanding enough that Billy Wilder, who spent the production documenting his frustration with her, said on the record that she was the best comedic actress he had ever directed. He said it through his teeth. He meant it. What the original kept in this hiding place, her actual craft. The specific thing she had always wanted, to do the work well, to have a performance matter to someone watching, was here, accessible, real. By 1960, the first hiding place was under pressure it could not sustain indefinitely. The Miller marriage was collapsing. The production of The Misfits, written by Miller, directed by John Huston, filmed in the Nevada desert in summer heat with a cast that included Clark Gable, was, by multiple docum, Ent accounts, a grueling experience that left her depleted in ways that took months to begin to surface in the record. The second hiding place was smaller. It was the handwriting. She had always written letters, journal entries, fragments of thought. By the later years, the private writing had become, according to accounts from Dr. Ralph Greenson, her psychiatrist in the last years, the place where she was most consistently herself. The notebooks did not require performance. They did not require the substitute's voice or the substitute's expression or the substitute's carefully managed public identity. They required only that she put down what was actually true, and she did. In 2010, fragments, poems, intimate notes, letters, edited by Stanley Buckthall and Bernard Comment, published transcribed material from these notebooks and correspondence. The voice in those documents is specific and unmistakable. Precise, self-analytical, literary in a way that bears the marks of years of serious reading, capable of looking directly at her own situation without flinching. It is not the substitute's voice. It is not the breathed intimacy, the suspended sentence, the coached helplessness. It is the voice of the woman who brought Chekhov to set in 1949 and genuinely needed the pages. What the second hiding place required of her. Privacy. The notebooks survived because they were never shown to the camera, which also meant they could not protect her from what the camera was doing to her. The system found its way in through her body. The barbiturate prescriptions that dominate the medical record of her last 2 years are documented in physician accounts, in the coroner's report filed August 1962, and in the toxicological findings from her autopsy. She was receiving prescriptions for chloral hydrate and Nembutal, both central nervous system depressants, from multiple physicians simultaneously, including Dr. Ralph Greenson and Dr. Hyman Engelberg. The prescriptions had begun, ACC, according to the record, as treatment for insomnia and anxiety. By the final months, they had become the substance that regulated her access to herself. This is the hiding place the system found because it was the floor all the other hiding places stood on. The notebooks required that she be present enough to write. The craft required that she be present enough to work. The intellectual life required that the person who had developed it, the specific, perceptive, alert person who had underlined Dostoevsky and argued on set, be accessible inside her own body on a given morning. The prescriptions made that access intermittent. Some days she was there. Some days something else occupied the space where she had been. The people close to her in those final months described a woman who could be, within the same week, startlingly clear and then absent in a way that was frightening to witness. Not gone, but behind something at a distance that couldn't be closed from the outside. What the original lost when this hiding place was found. Consistency of access to her own floor. The smallest one. According to accounts from people close to her in the final months of 1961 and into 1962, she was writing more rather than less as the access became unreliable. The notebooks continued. When she was present, she used the time. When she was not, she came back to it when she could. The analysis of her situation continued in private, in her handwriting, on the pages that nobody was asking to see. Whether the last hiding place held to the end, the record cannot fully confirm. What the record says is this. She was found dead at her home at 12305 5th Helena Drive in Brentwood, Los Angeles, in the early hours of August 5, 1962. She was 36 years old. The notebooks were found with her. There is a photograph taken backstage at Madison Square Garden on May 19, 1962. She is standing in the corridor, waiting to be announced. The dress has been sewn onto her body. Jeane Lewis designed it to be skin-colored, beaded, effectively transparent under stage lighting, requiring her to be nude beneath it. Her face in the photograph has the quality of something that has been arranged rather than inhabited. Her eyes show the particular distance that the people who knew her before 1955 recognized immediately when they saw it, and dreaded, because it meant the original was not accessible from the outside today. She was late, as she had been chronically late for years, so reliably late that Peter Lawford's introduction made it a punchline, and the crowd laughed, and the laughter confirmed the punchline, and the punchline confirmed what the machine had decided about who she was. Helplessly, charmingly disorganized. The substitute's known quality. Not the original's. The original had been punctual in the early years, according to multiple documented accounts. The lateness came later with the medications, with the performance weight, with the cost of maintaining two versions of yourself in the same body. When she walked to the microphone and sang, 15,000 people received something that had been designed to be received exactly as they received it. The president responded with a joke confirming the transaction. The cameras sent it to the country. Every person watching understood what they were seeing and understood, in the way the product had trained them to understand what it meant. None of them saw Norma Jeane. She was 35 years old. She had spent 13 years being built into something she had not chosen. She had fought the construction at every stage where she had access to a lever, the production company, the lawsuit, the move to New York, the actor's studio, the marriages, the notebooks. She had lost most of those fights, not because she was weak but because the system she was fighting had more resources, more time, and the specific structural advantage of making each individual loss look like something other than a fight. Return to the cold. Open. The woman who brought her books to set and laughed with her whole body and argued about the work and wanted to make a person in a theater seat feel less alone. That woman was built from specific things. The perceptiveness was built from the childhood. The humor was built from years of reading rooms. The directness was built from the experience of being unseen and deciding that the cure for it was not to look away from difficult things but to look directly at them. Those were her specific materials. They made her specifically herself in a way that could not be fully replicated. The second woman, in the backstage photograph, in the sewn-on dress, in the stage lighting that made the dress disappear, was built from different materials. She was built from coaching and managed press and simplified biography and the systematic removal, over years, of the specific qualities that had made the original inconvenient for the product. The breathed voice, the coached walk, the public persona of helpless, available, beautiful blankness, built piece by piece, running on its own by 1962. The distance between those two women is not a distance of years. It is a distance of installations, each one documented, each one traceable, each one landing on a specific thing that had been hers before it was taken, and replacing it with something that fit the version he was building. She died on August 4th to 5th, 1962. The official cause, according to the Los Angeles County Coroner's report, was acute barbiturate poisoning. She was 36 years old. The original had been unreachable from the outside for years. What ended was the substitute, and the body that had been required to carry both. Most people, when they think of Marilyn Monroe, think of the image, the dress, the voice, the specific quality of presence at Madison Square Garden, the breathed birthday, the president's joke, the 15,000 people who understood exactly what they were being offered and accepted it without Stein. That image is on posters in 40 countries. It is in the cultural shorthand of industries that did not exist when she was alive. It is, by every measure of reproduction and recognition, one of the most successful products in the history of American entertainment. It is the substitute, built piece by piece, finished in 1962. What the substitute left behind, and what most accounts of her life treat as the primary story, is that image. The tragedy that follows it. The mythology that accumulates after August 5, 1962, and has been accumulating ever since. But there is a second inventory, a different set of remains. Those are what this act is about. The house at 5th Helena Drive was searched after her death. Among the items found, notebooks, handwritten pages, letters she had written and letters she had received. Fragments, poems, observations, self-analysis, the kind of private writing that happens at 3 in the morning when the performance is off and there is no audience and the only requirement is that what goes on the page is true. These materials pass through the estate and eventually, decades later, into a form the public could access. In 2010, Fragments, poems, intimate notes, letters, edited by Stanley Buchthal and Bernard Comment, published transcribed versions of the private writing. Read them and something specific happens. The voice on those pages is not the substitute's voice. It is not the breathed intimacy, the coached suspension, the upward inflection that turned every statement into a question. It is direct. It is precise. It is the voice of someone who has been reading seriously for 20 years and whose own thinking has been shaped by that reading. Someone who can look at her own situation without softening it, without the distance of performance, with the same quality of direct attention she had been using since childhood on the situations of people around her. It is the voice of the woman who brought Chekhov to set in 1949. She was St. Ill there, in the handwriting, in the pages that were never shown to the camera. One note, undated, in her own hand. I am trying to find myself as a human being. Sit with that for a moment. Not as an actress. Not as Marilyn Monroe, the name on the contract, the name on the posters, the name that the publicity department had constructed around a frame that was built to hold a product rather than a person. Not even as Norma Jeane Baker, the name she had been given before the system got to her. As a human being. The most fundamental claim a person can make on their own existence. And she was still making it. Still fighting for it. Still, in the private handwriting that the machine had never been able to reach, insisting that there was a self worth finding. That is the original. That is who was there before 1946. That is who was there all the way through. Diminished, hidden, medicated, cornered into smaller and smaller rooms, but never, in the private record, fully absent. The substitute performed helplessness. The original kept writing in the dark. The people who had known Norma Jeane Baker before the installations described her in consistent terms across decades of interviews and memoirs, consistent in the way that accounts are consistent when they are describing something real rather than constructing something convenient. The laugh, the full-body laugh that turned heads, the directness of eye contact with a new person she had decided to trust, the quality of full attention given without hedging, which was its own kind of courage from someone whose childhood had given her every reason to withhold it. The way she argued about the work. Not for status, not for control, but because getting it right was a physical urgency for her, something that could not be simulated by compliance. The books, the dry humor, the specific warmth she extended to people she deemed worth it, which was warmer than anything the substitute could produce because it was chosen rather than formed. These accounts described the same person. Across different decades, different biographers, different people who knew her at different points in her life, the original appears consistently in the same shape. She was real. She is recoverable in the record. The substitute has not fully buried her, because the substitute could not get to the handwriting. The image the world kept is the substitute's. The note in the archive is the original's. I am trying to find myself as a human being. In her handwriting, undated, found in the house after she died. That sentence belongs to the woman who was there before Ben Lyon suggested a name change and before the voice coaches arrived and before the publicity department simplified the childhood and before the dumb blonde became the public face of someone who was reading Dostoevsky between takes. That woman never fully surrendered. The substitute ran the public life. The original kept writing. The note is in the archive. Intact. In her hand. Not the poster. Not the dress. Not the breathed birthday at Madison Square Garden in a dress sewn onto a body that the machine had been building for 13 years. One woman trying to find herself. Still trying. In the handwriting on the page. That is who she was. That is what survived. Nothing after.